Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Ben Kinsley is here with me, not in the studio, but somewhere out in La La Land. Ben, how are you?
La La Land.
La La Land.
I prefer to think of it as I'm out in the real world. That's
Oh,
how
there you go. That's probably true. You're out of Vermont. That's for sure. But anyway, we have a very special guest today, Meredith Angwin, and I've got a little introduction here, so bear with me. Meredith is a chemist who has been an advocate for nuclear power for a long time and an outspoken expert about Vermont's electricity grid. She has been on the show 3 times, if memory serves me correctly, has appeared on numerous times on talk shows and interviewed by the media, and has authored 2 books, which we're going to talk about tonight, which has garnered her national attention. One is Campaign for Clean Air, Strategy for Pro-Nuclear Advocacy, and we did have her on the show to talk about that. And Shortening the Grid, the high fragility of our electric grid. We also talked about that on the show. Meredith raises concerns when she asks the question, are blackouts coming to New England? Which makes all of us stand up. And also has appeared on many shows talking about whether the Texas experience could happen here in Vermont. And today we're going to talk about all of it. So we've got to move along. So Meredith, welcome. Could you talk a little bit about yourself, what I've left out of the intro?
Well, thank you very much. And yes, you gave me a lovely intro. And I will say, I'm a chemist, and I was working toward my PhD in mineral chemistry and very interested in electricity and the grid. And I became an expert in geothermal energy, which was very nice because I was living on the West Coast at the time, and most of it's out there on the West Coast. So or inland a little bit, like Nevada or Utah or whatever. So I had a lot of kind of fun adventures in those days because I'd go out to the drill sites and stuff. And that was
nice.
really, and it was another thing that was good about it is that geothermal drilling is not quite the same as oil and gas, but it's a similar enough technology that, it made it easier for me to follow some of the things that go on in oil and gas. So then after that, I was in geothermal, and I became one of the first women project managers at the Electric Power Research Institute, which is an institute funded by many electric utilities to do research which will benefit all the utilities. So making different types of technologies more reliable and more efficient. And I work mostly on corrosion control and on pollution control. So those were the 2 things that I was working on when I was there. I was in the geothermal group, and then I transferred to nuclear, and I was sort of in nuclear ever since. So when I moved out here, the Electric Power Research Institute is in Palo Alto. Well, there's actually a branch of it on the East Coast too, but I was in Palo Alto, California. And when I moved out here to be near the kids had moved to the East Coast, I began looking around for things. I began writing, and I encountered other pro-nuclear people who were testifying and so forth, and writing letters to the editor in favor of Vermont Yankee. So I joined them, and I realized how much I had to learn about advocacy, because as my chemistry career included geothermal, nuclear, and fossil. As a matter of fact, I didn't talk much about that, but I have some patents in pollution control for fossil. And I realized I didn't know anything about advocacy. I had no clue. So I was learning sort of as I went, and I was reading, and people were advising me, and it was great. And then I decided I would write a book about it. I would write a book about how to be a pro-nuclear advocate. And one of the reasons is that, in general, many pro-nuclear advocates, especially back then, were pretty technical people, and they were often kind of shy. And so you go to a meeting and there would be, some anti-nuclear people dressed in elaborate costumes and doing a chant. And then there'd be one of our people, men or women, going up and giving some technical data about why nuclear is safe. And it just wasn't even a contest of who was more interesting to listen to. And so anyway, I began writing this book, and I learned a lot while writing it. But one of the things is I felt I had to start where people were. What I mean by that is it's all very well to talk about how to hold a demonstration or how to hold a counter demonstration if there's already an anti-nuclear demonstration going on. But when you get right down to it, a lot of the people are shy. And so the first part of my book is advocacy for the shy, writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds, getting yourself in front of a committee, and things like that, as opposed to being on the street holding a placard and stuff. But anyway, it was a lot of fun, and I made a lot of friends when I was doing it, and
That's great.
And I enjoyed it.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later in the show, because we had a lot of questions for you. I think you and I first met when you were talking about Vermont Yankee. That's
Right.
where we met. I think Ben and you met when you were on the show, right? Wasn't that the first time you met Meredith?
Yeah, it was. And, yeah, I'm surprised we didn't run across each other when you were involved in Vermont Yankee, but yeah, that's I think that's when we met.
Yeah, and one thing you'll find out about Meredith as this show goes on, Meredith, as much as she knows all of this stuff that I have no clue, and I've told her this many times, and is that when she talks, I actually understand her. And I think that's a gift, to be able to translate what she knows in that head of hers, to be able to talk to us, you and me, Ben, let's face it.
Yeah.
And
The dummies in the room.
Exactly. Well, not quite, but close. But and when we talk about her advocacy book, you'll see, and as she explains all these other things, you'll see what a well-spoken woman she is. Ben, you want to take it away?
Yeah. So one of the things, the primary thing we wanted to talk about tonight was this new book that you and your husband wrote together, I believe.
Oh, that was
called,
it.
That's
Yeah, it's an old book. It's an old
that's
book.
an old book.
I just found it. I
Oh,
didn't even know that they wrote it, but it's very
so
interesting.
this is a mystery book. It's
Exactly.
It's not. What happened was that there were a lot of people testifying in favor of Vermont Yankee. Many people, some worked at the plant, some didn't. And I thought, we should capture this. We should capture all the different reasons people have, because, somebody might say, I want nuclear because of climate change. And someone else will say, climate change is a hoax. Well, fine. They both want nuclear for different reasons. And I felt that it was worth capturing that because it really is a grassroots look at the situation, that everybody has their own reasons for whatever they're doing. I mean, think about voting for a candidate. Some people vote because he's got this position, and some people vote for him because he's got another position unrelated to the first one, and,
Right.
and unfortunately the nuclear dialogue tends to get all stultified. And I wanted to be sure that people knew that there were many people pro-nuclear with many different ideas about why they were.
Yeah, and a lot of the testimony, Ben, that we heard at the public hearings that you and I went to on Vermont Yankee was included in this book. And I don't know, we may know some of those folks who testified, because they were very interesting meetings.
So how many testimonies did you capture in this book, which is called Voices for Vermont Yankee, right? That's the name of the book.
I think I captured like some 14 or 15. I mean, it wasn't huge. It's a thin little book, and each person was like a page and a half and a picture, because after all, there was like a 3-minute limit.
Right.
for how they could, what they said to the PUC. So they didn't have, tomes to give me, which was good because what I wanted was that these are all different reasons. They're all valid reasons, but they're different. It isn't like if you don't believe in climate change, you don't have any use for nuclear. There were people there who didn't. And there were people there who said nuclear is the only way we're going to decarbonize. So
right, because you could be pro-nuclear because you believe in because of the climate aspects of nuclear, like how clean of a technology it is,
Right.
versus but you could also support it because it's a cheap source of energy and it's a reliable source of energy. So like there's multiple reasons why you could support that as an energy source.
yeah.
Exactly.
So one of the things, of course, we know now Entergy did decide to close the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant back in 2014. There was a number of factors involved. They actually cited cost as the driving factor. What do you think? What were your takeaways on why Vermont Yankee was not successful in continuing to operate in Vermont?
Well, there are a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons was that if you really began watching the last 2 years of Vermont Yankees life, you would see that the legislature and everybody kept coming up with new taxes and new fines and new whatever. I mean, at one point they said, Vermont Yankee has to fund, I don't know, some number of thousands of beds and build new shelters in case people have to evacuate. No other plant, no other even nuclear plant has any requirement like that. And they were like, oh no, this is it. You've got to do that. And then there was, honestly, there was the Clean Energy Fund that they had to give money to. And if they made more than 6.1 cents per kilowatt hour on the grid, they had to give whatever amount above 6.1, half to the state. At one point, they wrote a $17.8 million check to the state because they'd been paid, quote, too much on the grid. I mean, there were plenty of reasons why it was not going to work for Vermont Yankee to be in Vermont. I will say one other thing, though, and that is that as a rule, nuclear plants that are more than one to a site are better, have better economics than standalone plants like Vermont Yankee. When there's two plants on a site, then the fact you have to have a water chemistry lab, it's shared between the two plants. The fact you have to have, some security people, and it's shared between the two plants. There are a lot of sort of overhead things that are you have to have a simulator for training is shared between the two plants usually. So in general, a standalone plant is one down in terms of economics. So just from the get-go, without anything that the legislature does.
I agree with you. We didn't stop harping on those people like for the last, as you said, 2 years. It was just relentless. There was nothing they could do right. And I don't blame them for packing it in. Of course, it left us feeling the pinch because they did some things to our benefit, whether people want to admit it or not.
We had to go buy power from Canada.
Yeah, right, exactly.
We did indeed. I remember when they were so excited about the power from Canada, they said, well, it's a good price. And I'm like, actually, it wasn't a price. It will follow the market. In other words, this was like an adjustable rate mortgage, while Vermont Yankee was saying, this is the price we can give you. And Canada was saying, well, whatever the market is doing, we'll be doing the same. It wasn't such a great deal. It was announced as a great deal, but it wasn't.
And we won't even talk about what they did to Vernon. When Vermont Yankee left, the impact on that town was dramatic because it was very high paying jobs. People had moved into the town to move into that area to work in Vermont Yankee, and they left, and the revenue for the town sort of crashed a little. they're still, I think they're still struggling. We were always going to follow up with Vernon to see how they're doing, because it was taking them a couple of years to recoup and recover from Vermont Yankee leaving. So anyway, you mentioned your book about clean air and strategies for pro-nuclear advocacy, and you talked quite a bit about it. So, but I found it a book that you could use for any advocacy.
Yes.
It wasn't, the way you wrote it, it wasn't specifically for nuclear power. It was for anything that you wanted to have your voice heard. And I thought that was a great way to write a book, because it was universal. Did you get that opinion from people?
Yes, I got that opinion from other people too. And even as I was writing the book, I was so concerned that the pro-nuclear people didn't know about advocacy, that I was busy write advocacy. When I was nearly finished, I thought, wait a minute, nobody will know that this is about nuclear. So if you look at the book, it has 5 sections called white papers within it about why nuclear is a superior source of electricity, and so there is material that you can use within the book as ammunition in a pro-nuclear advocacy section, but most of the book is just advocacy. What works.
It's excellent. I don't know, Ben, if you've ever read. I know you were with the show with us, but it was, I mean, you could use it in any classroom anywhere about how to, or any nonprofit anywhere, how to get your word, get your voices heard. It was excellent. So, and could we talk a little, this is sort of not following in any logic here, but the book talks about clean air. Could you talk about why nuclear energy contributes to clean air? And
well, yeah, I mean, in this case, it's both technical and personal. It's technical because whenever you have an efficient combustion system, it's going to actually have nitrogen oxides being produced. And what happens is at very high temperatures, the air burns itself. What I mean is the N2 in the air will unite with the O2 in the air. So you can't actually stop nitrogen oxides from being produced. You can do it to some extent, and it's a little, I don't know how to describe it. If you keep the hottest part of the flame separate from high oxygen areas, you somewhat diminish the amount of nitrogen oxides that'll be formed. But you see, the thing is, what you're doing is you're sort of burning rich at that point, and then you've got to do something later on to get rid of all the stuff you didn't burn. So you've got a two-phase thing. And when I first started in this area, they didn't have low NOx burners that were automatically two-phase, that is, low oxygen here, high oxygen there, and so forth. What they had was what they called BOOS, B-O-O-S, burners out of service, that they had a whole bunch of burners in a power plant, and they take some of them out of service to lower the temperature of the power plant, and that's how they prevented the nitrogen oxides from forming.
Interesting.
So, and we're talking about like natural gas fired plants at that point.
Natural gas fired plants in general. This is what we're talking about. That now, what you can do after that, if you, the other things that people do are you can get ammonia, and catalysts or not catalysts, and at the end of the pipe, that is, when the exhaust gases with the nitrogen oxides are coming out of the system that was burning them, you can mix them with ammonia, and that reaction will turn some of the nitrogen oxides into N2, which is where they started out when they were air, and so forth. It's done all over. You can see ammonia and urea being added to the exhaust gases in many places. The problem with that, and nothing's perfect, and I don't mean to just dog on this, but the thing is that when you get right down to it, if you really want to drive a reaction to completion, you have to have more than equal amounts. Like if the reaction takes 1 unit of this to mix with 1 unit of that to give the product, if you really want everything to be burned up, you put in 1.2 units of this and 1 unit of that so that it all gets burned and all gets united, and you have a little extra that doesn't react. If you try to do it exactly this much plus this much and that's all going to react, it isn't all going to react. It's called Le Chatelier's principle. But at any rate, what I'm saying is that what holds us back is that adding ammonia to the air is not allowed either. So you have to control for what is called ammonia slip, that is ammonia slipping into the stream. So you can't add too much ammonia in order to get all the NOx taken care of. Anyway, it's interesting. It's fun for a chemist. I don't know if it's so fun for people breathing, but it's fun for a chemist.
As long as it's clear, we don't care. Ben, do you mind if I move ahead to the Shortening the Grid, the second book? Because
Yeah.
we're running out of time here.
Keep it moving.
So Meredith, your next book is entitled Shortening the Grid.
Shorting grid.
Yes, that's right. I apologize. I was going to ask you about that because I've been called it shortening the grid, the hidden
Like short
fragility of our electric grid. It took me a while to figure that one out. So it's been written that when rolling blackouts come to the electric grid, they will be old news to the grid insiders. And I just want you to talk about the book and to talk about the grid perhaps, and the fragility, which is a tough word, may I say, to pronounce, the fragility of the grid. And then you can talk about the opera singer.
Oh, gosh.
Just for a light moment there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the book "Shorting the Grid: The Hidden Fragility of the Grid," I actually named it in both a pun and an homage to The Big Short, and in both cases, The Big Short and Shorting the Grid, you see how these complex systems that were built on top of each other, in The Big Short, it's the collateralized debt obligations and the tranches and all these things that they were doing, instead of like you have a mortgage and you pay it back and then we're all set. That is what kind of brought the system down, because it got so complex that nobody could really follow it. Nobody had an interest in following it, because as long as they were making money, they didn't have an interest in following it. And pretty soon we had the 2008 financial crisis, which was started by the collapse of all these complex mortgage schemes. Well, when I began really learning about the grid, I began to see parallels I didn't like. No one was responsible for reliability. Everybody's responsible for reliability. I mean, the RTO has some responsibilities, but they can't do certain things, and NERC has some responsibility, but they can't do certain things. And when you get right down to it, the buck never stops anywhere, because everybody can point a finger at another agency and say, well, if they had, then I could have. But I couldn't have. But of course you couldn't have. It's not in your charter. Well, yeah, but it's not in my charter, but it was in their charter. Anyway, it was very upsetting to me when I began to realize it. And also, when I was first beginning to study it, I read a article by a man who was on the PUC of, I think, Minnesota at the time, I'm not sure, Travis Kavula. And it was an article, Can Electricity Be a Market? And he kind of concluded that not really. And one of the things he said in that is that the rules for the areas in which electricity was supposedly a market, the tariffs, were several times as long as the tariffs for the areas that were supposedly not a market but regulated monopolies, because the RTO areas are layers upon layers upon layers of rules, hoping to get the right results. This is all very vague. Let me give you an example from my book. In the RTO area, our RTO area, in 2017, Christmas week to New Year's week, it was very cold here. 2017 Christmas week to 2018 New Year's week, very, very cold. And when it's very cold, the natural gas-fired plants cannot get gas as much as they'd like, because gas is being used to heat houses, and the utilities that provide heat to the houses by non-interruptible contracts, because houses need heat. And the utilities that make power by interruptible contracts, which are cheaper, but I don't think the gas companies would necessarily sell them non-interruptible contracts to the point that every utility that's making, every gas-fired plant that's making power would have one, because there isn't enough pipeline. So, okay, let's go here. And so here's the very cold week, and the natural gas-fired plants can't get enough natural gas. And what they're doing, many of them, are what's called dual fuel. They can use oil or they can use natural gas, either one. The question is, where's the oil coming from? And so many, the RTO, our RTO, put something called the Winter Reliability Project in place, where the RTO underwrote utilities keeping oil on site. And power plants, generators, natural gas generators keeping oil on site. And so when they couldn't get natural gas, they used the oil. And if you think, oh, this is trivial, this isn't a big, during the cold weather, 30% of our grid was oil fired. 30% of the electricity on the grid was oil fired. This wasn't a trivial small program that we could have easily done without. Okay, so there was oil fired. Well, at the end of, the problem is that the RTO, according to the rules that it operates under, is not supposed to give advantage to one kind of generator over another. And so FERC said, when they set up the Winter Reliability Program, the federal agency, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, said to our local RTO, nice program you've got there, you got to end it in 3 years. Yeah. It's in 3 years, it's over. And the reason is, you can't be one of these people that goes around buying, helping oil when there are other kinds of power plants. Well, let me tell you, they weren't trying to help oil. They were trying to keep the grid from collapsing.
Right.
And they succeeded at that. And after that, people were like, oh, we've got to do something to make power plants keep oil on site without actually telling them to keep oil on site. You see, we have to have our lawyers set up a program which will give the power plants incentives to keep oil on site without us actually mentioning the word oil.
Oh, great.
And so they did. They did a pay-per-performance, and it turned out to be a disaster. I could spend a whole bunch of time. It's not a disaster. It's just that in one one-day crisis. Pay-for-performance was supposed to transfer money from power plants that came online when the grid was stressed to power plants that didn't come online when the grid was stressed were supposed to pay a fine, and that fine went to the power plants that did come online when the grid was stressed. So there was about a 12-hour kind of semi-disaster going on, and luckily we got outside help from like New York and stuff, and everything was okay. But meanwhile, at the end of it, they said, okay, this triggered pay for performance. So you power plants that didn't come online, you got to pay the power plants that did come online. The trouble is that this carefully modulated product of many, many meetings and many, many compromises of how much each power plant had to pay under what kind of circumstances ended up with the power plants that came online, this is only one day, being paid $8 million more than they expected from the power plants that didn't come online.
That's astronomical.
$8 million more for one day.
Well, there's something wrong with that.
So there's like, oh, they didn't do the addition right. And then there were things that were actually funny. And to show you how complex and ridiculous the rules get, if you are somebody who is willing to take your plant offline when the grid is stressed, then you get paid just as if you had brought more. I'm sorry, if you are a business that decided to take your business offline when the grid is stiff. Oh gosh, the grid operator just called me, and I'm out of here because I know the grid can't take my requirements, so I'm out of here. And the good news is that the grid operator is going to pay me for getting out of there and making it easier for them. So that's called demand response. And they also decided that they were going to do the equivalent of demand response for efficiency programs. Except that it turned out that they decided that they wouldn't do the equivalent of demand response for efficiency programs on weekends. I wasn't in on those decisions. I'm just saying. So the day that the grid was distressed turned out to be a weekend, and everybody and there was $8 million shortfall to make up. So they just basically went. The RTO basically went to everybody and said, okay, pay up in proportion to how big you are. Pay up so that we can make this $8 million. They went to the people who had come online, who were getting the $8 million. They went to the people who hadn't come online, who hadn't paid enough to make up the $8 million. And then they went to the efficiency program people who were actually not allowed to participate in the market at that time and said, you pay up too. And the efficiency people paid up. But what I'm trying to say is, you see how convoluted this is.
For sure. And we, the people, knew nothing that was going on.
Oh, of course.
As long as their lights turn on.
Exactly. What do we care? Wow.
Yeah. So here's
$8
a couple questions. Talking about the complexity of the grid, do you think we are safer today? Our grid is safer today than it was in 2017 when this happened?
No.
And why?
I'm clear on that. I'm very clear on it because basically the more power plants with fuel on site, okay, and that means coal plants and nuclear plants in general, that retire and that are substituted for by power plants that are come on when they want to, which is like wind. I mean, no one can order the wind to blow. So that it's not, you can say it's this and you can say it's that, but you can't say that we know we're going to have a lot of wind in a cold snap. We can't say that because that's not what humans can say. We don't control it. And then, so you have the intermittents that run on their own schedule, and then you have gas, which is just-in-time delivery. And if the gas pipelines are overloaded, then they are not able to deliver to the power plants. So the combination is a pretty desperate situation. And this is one of the things to change this subject a little bit here. This is one of the things that after the Texas thing, the Texas 48 hours without power, and there were people who actually froze to death in their homes.
Right.
Actually died of hypothermia in their homes.
111 of them.
Yes.
That's a lot of people in Texas.
So it is a lot of people who died of hypothermia, and some of them died of carbon monoxide poisoning trying to keep it. But a direct result of having a cold home. 111 people died, direct result of having a cold home. This isn't about whether or not they could get to the hospital in time or anything. This is like the home, they couldn't get their home warm enough. So afterwards, a lot of people were like, well, you see, this is because renewables failed. And a lot of other people were like, renewables failed? No, it was because natural gas failed. Well, it was both. It was both. The renewables, the wind, as is common during an extremely cold snap, the wind ended up dying down. It was doing great at the beginning of the cold snap, and then it went pretty much to zero. And that happens. And then the natural gas couldn't make up. Texas is very dependent on wind. And all of a sudden, people are using more space heaters, okay?
Right.
And there isn't any wind, and the natural gas can't make up for all those space heaters. And so the grid operator said, okay, the whole grid may go down if we let this continue. We have to shed load. We have to start rolling blackouts. And they did a terrible job with the rolling blackouts because they didn't roll. They just areas went black for 2 days. And but the thing is that it was both. And so I'm trying to, I have something which I call the fatal trifecta of how a grid fails. And the first thing is you're overly dependent on renewables that are running on their own schedule. Okay, the sun rises and sets, the wind blows and doesn't blow, not on a schedule set by humans. Okay.
Interesting.
Then you have overdependence on natural gas, which can only be carried by pipelines, and you can't store it at the station. So even if you know, gosh, there's a big cold stop coming, you can't store the natural gas at the station. And so the power plant can only make as much power as it can make because it can only get as much natural gas as it can get. And then the third, so those are the 2 legs of the trifecta. The third leg was already in place in Texas because they're not connected to other grids. But I keep saying it wouldn't have mattered because the other grids were in trouble too. And nobody's going to send power to your grid and cut off people in their own grid.
Meredith, I'm sorry. Could I ask you a question? Because I didn't understand something you said. You said that they didn't do the rolling blackouts well because they shut off this neighborhood and then they, I guess, moved. What is a rolling blackout if it's not, in fact, shutting off different areas? I don't know.
One of the municipal utilities, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it, in Texas actually had rolling blackouts, and it did them well. That is, the power went off for half an hour and then it went back on again. Okay, that's how, and the next neighborhood over had half an hour without power. Okay, what happened in the main Texas grid is that it was so bad, the situation was so bad that it didn't move on to the next area.
Oh.
Areas were shut off for 48 hours. A rolling blackout is half an hour, half an hour, half an hour.
Oh, I see. I didn't understand that. Thank you.
And
And 48 hours is a long time without electricity, that's for sure.
yes, and one of the things that was just, I mean, it was such a complex mess. It's the only way to describe it. For example, it didn't seem like people kind of knew what they were doing. So one of the things is that the gas pipelines in Texas have compressors. They all do. Some compressors are gas fired and then tend to make some pollution. Other compressors are electricity run, and they tend to be non-polluting. And Texas has been, like many areas, kind of moving over to the electricity run ones. So anyway, they begin the rolling blackouts, and at first it looks like they're doing it okay. They shut off power to one area. They shut off power to those compressors, which means there's a different bunch of natural gas-fired plants that can't get gas now.
Oh, wow.
So that means that you've got to make a bigger rolling blackout because they can't get gas. It's been shut off because the electricity was shut off. So anyway, it was just, there's just no really good way to describe that situation without using obscenities. So I won't use obscenities. I'm just trying to say that, there are terms.
I'm just
So
oh, go ahead, Ben.
So one question I have here, because we saw what happened in the Carolinas also this past year with a pipeline going out and what that does. This was a gas pipeline, like a fuel pipeline, not a natural gas pipeline, but that was due to a cyber attack. What are the implications for, these increasing in frequency? Vermont is clearly not immune to this. The UVM Medical Center got hacked as well. What are the implications of that if a pipeline gets shut down, a natural gas pipeline gets shut down, or one of our electrical grids, or even an energy producer like a plant gets shut down because of a cyber attack? Like, what does that do to our grid, especially if it's during peak demand?
Well, it can be extremely bad, and one of the problems, of course, is that it could spread. In other words, if one plant gets shut down and other plants can't make up the issues, then there'll be blackouts, and they won't necessarily be rolling because maybe there's going to be another plant shut down by the same cyber attack. For what it's worth, I was in a Zoom bombed recently in a meeting, and it's never happened to me before. I was in a women's meeting. Let me be honest, it was a breast cancer survivors group meeting, and all of a sudden, all these guys with Russian names came on and began saying rather obscene things to us. I got off immediately, and but the other people on it told me they began running porn. So I mean, cyber attacks can happen to anybody. I mean, this was I was really like, I'd heard of cyber attacks, but I'd never been in one, and so that was very a very unpleasant thing. If you want to stay awake at night and be really concerned about this, and it's a worthwhile thing to be worried about, I recommend Ted Koppel's book Lights Out, and what would happen in a major cyber attack. And it isn't pretty. It looks it's like 80% of the people, if the cyber attack, if the electricity grid went down in the United States for 3 months or something, 80% of the people would die or something. It's just something huge. It's huge.
Wow.
Yeah, we're so dependent on electricity now that, to heat our homes or to function, like to get, food even, or cook food or any of those things that, it would not be pretty.
Yeah, Meredith, do any of these plants or grid people, do they have what if scenarios that they practice? I bet they do in Texas now.
Well, of course, grid operators like nuclear operators and airline pilots and so forth, they definitely do all kinds of simulator training. And I mean,
Right.
you know, if this happens, then how do we respond and stuff like that. The issue is what happens when it's beyond what you were
Well,
trained for. In
Right,
other
exactly.
when I'm sure the Texas grid operators knew what to do to set up a rolling blackout, but they didn't understand what was going to happen when they began shutting off gas to new power plants that were actually working at the time that they started the blackout. I mean, yeah, everybody tries, but you see, the thing is that that's sort of like my husband used to work in software and digital map quality control. And he said that you can't inspect quality control into the product. You have to build it into the system that's making the product. You can't just, and in a way, training the operators better is a little bit like inspecting it into the product. I mean, you have to have a reliable situation. Just-in-time delivery of natural gas is an intrinsically fragile situation. And when I talk about fragility, I want to say that it's not an either-or situation. What I mean is the grid fragile? Is the grid not fragile? The question is, what does it take to bring it to a bad situation? If it takes, you know, the world's worst hurricane before anything bad happens on the grid, it's not a fragile grid. The grid cannot be built to withstand anything. But if you go to California now, you can see billboards saying, shut off, you be quiet, shut off your electricity as much as possible between 4 and 9 at night. In other words, during peak use hours, because we may not have enough electricity. And we may have to institute rolling blackouts. In other words, if it's hot in California, which is not necessarily the coldest state, and it's between 4 and 9 at night, the grid's fragile. That's a fragile grid. And the more you depend on natural gas and renewables, the more fragile your grid gets.
In New Jersey, we used to be told to shut off our air conditioners at night when it was, when it was hot, but between the peak hours, we always had to turn off our air conditioning. Same thing.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So, speaking of rolling blackouts and the Texas situation and the fragility of our grid, you gave a presentation called Blackouts in New England. What do you think the risk is to our grid? We've talked about Texas, we've talked about California, but what is the risk of our own grid? What is the chance or of likelihood that we are going to see rolling blackouts here in New England?
Well, okay. Our grid operator about 2 years ago did forward-looking estimations of fuel security and grid fragility. And they did 23 scenarios. And of those 23 scenarios, and many of the scenarios had a problem. In other words, some power plant went down or some compressor went down. There was some problem on the grid. And some of the scenarios was everything's great, okay? Well, out of those 23 scenarios, 19 led to rolling blackouts. And the year they were estimating was 2025. And so this year, Gordon Wiley, the president of ISO New England, said, well, it might be sooner. And the reason it might be sooner, between you and me, is that a lot of the power plants we used to have with fuel stored on site aren't there anymore So the grid is even more dependent on natural gas and renewables. So it's kind of funny because when I gave that talk about blackouts, one person who was at the talk said, "Oh, you know, you're listening to the, you know, over pessimistic propaganda or something like that, you know, from the grid operator." And this year, the same person wrote, "Well, it looks like this could happen, you know. I mean, it, you know, because it really is, it's really closer now. I mean, the guy was in 2019, they were estimating 2025, and it's going to, I don't know. I tell you one thing that's funny. When I brought out my book, the man who said, "You're listening to this over pessimistic propaganda," he said that, and other people said that. And then the book was published in October 2020, and Texas happened in February 2021.
Yeah.
And it's pretty funny that nobody, it's not funny, haha, but it's vaguely amusing that nobody has claimed that I'm listening to overly pessimistic propaganda recently.
So
Yeah, because they saw what happened in Texas, they probably see what's happening in California. So what are the conditions that would cause rolling blackouts in New England? Is it a cold snap, an extended cold snap, or is it like a layer of different occurrences that would have to happen?
Basically, it would be an extended cold snap. An extended cold snap, the pipelines we have are the pipelines we have. We're not getting any more of them. There might be gazillions of tons or whatever the measure is of sail in the Marcellus, but we're not getting it over here, okay? Because we're not building any more pipelines. Now, I'm not making a statement that we should or shouldn't. I'm just saying the fact is there aren't any pipelines on the way. And therefore, we're endangered by cold snaps. We're simply endangered by them because there's not really a good system for burning oil. Now, oil did go up to 10% of the grid earlier this week, and so it did go up there, but it didn't get. But if with the nuclear plants, Vermont Yankee and Pilgrim shut down, and Brayton Point, the big, and I forget what the other one, Mount Tom, the big coal stations shut down. More and more is dependent on the gas pipelines, and there's only the same number of them that there used to be. So it would be an extended cold snap. I also want to say that the grid operator pointed out that because of this, we are more dependent on LNG deliveries than we have been in the past. Mm-hmm. And we can't get liquefied natural gas deliveries from Louisiana, that we can't get them. And the reason is that there's a law against it. And what I mean by that is that there's a law that says that only an American-built and American flag ship can deliver goods between 2 points on the American coast. So you can't. It's called the Jones Act.
And we don't have any ships that can transport liquid natural gas.
That's right. So if we have liquid natural gas that is being produced in Louisiana, and we're a major exporter of liquefied natural gas, it's on its way to Europe, or conceivably to
the Caribbean Asia, or something like that.
More likely to be to Europe. Yeah. And meanwhile, if we want liquefied natural gas in Boston, it's going to come basically from South America or the Middle East. And one of the things that was really funny, I don't remember exactly where I was seeing this, but it was like these ships with the liquefied natural gas, they go where the prices are best for them. And there was this one ship that went through the Suez Canal. It filled up in somewhere in the Middle East and went down through the Suez Canal on its way to Asia. And then the prices in Europe went so high that it turned around in the Indian Ocean and is going back through the Suez Canal the other way to get to Europe.
Wonderful.
Now, we're competing in the same market. We're competing in the same market.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy. So here's a what do we do to make our grid less fragile? I mean, is Vermont insulated at all by the rest of New England because we have power lines going into Quebec that can draw basically, I wouldn't say unlimited, but a very high amount of power from Hydro-Quebec if we needed to. Is Vermont insulated from the rest of New England a little bit, or is this sort of a shared experience for everybody?
It's a shared experience. I hate to be too negative, but it is a shared experience. I mean, if you look at the fuel study that the grid operator did, they point out that Hydro-Quebec only promises half the amount of electricity to England that it generally delivers. What I mean is it takes on a, quote, capacity supply obligation that's half the amount that it usually delivers. And the reason for that is when it's really cold weather in Quebec, they keep the electricity at home. They
need it there.
Why not?
There. And as I say, it's all legal because, well, everything's pretty much legal. But what I mean is that you could predict it by looking at what capacity supply obligation do they take on. Not as much as they deliver on an ordinary day.
Yep. So Meredith, I think we only have a few minutes left. According to my clock, we have a minute left. Do you see a renewed interest in nuclear given the focus on climate change and maybe the improvements in technology and the desire for low carbon emissions? Are we starting to think maybe nuclear isn't so bad?
Well, I think that there definitely is an interest in nuclear among younger people, especially. And when I was campaigning for Vermont Yankee, I asked my friend Howard Schaefer, what organization can these people join who are pro Vermont Yankee? And he said, well, the American Nuclear Society. Well, you're kidding me. It's $185 a year and it has big meetings in big hotels and you have to prove that you're a nuclear professional to join. Are you kidding? But nowadays we have all kinds of groups. We have Generation Atomic with younger people, Mothers for Nuclear, which has branches in all on the East Coast and the West Coast. Yep. Women in Nuclear. We have a website which I find very interesting called Nuclear Barbarians. He got very tired of the idea of everybody's pussyfooting around, and he said, no, we're the pro-nuclear barbarians here. I mean, it's a very different ethos. It's like, you know, songs and barbarians and I don't know. It's very different from join the American. I mean, when I joined the American Nuclear Society, I had to send them a resume showing I'd worked in the nuclear industry, and it was the only place to join.
That's not a way to attract new people. Ben, how are we doing? Ben, how are we doing on time?
We are just about out of time.
Okay.
So we should probably wrap it up. But Meredith, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. We always learn a lot, Meredith. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Thank you all.
I always tell people to buy my book, Shorting the Grid.
Oh, yes.
It's nothing wrong with telling people.
Short. Could you pronounce that again?
Shorting the Grid.
Shorting the Grid.
Yes, like shorting.
I better learn that.
A circuit, a short circuit.
Oh, short circuit. That I got. Thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We love Meredith on this show. And we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.